Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Middle Way Mom Reads, where we dig into books that enhance and inform our homeschooling journey. I'm Shannon, a homeschooling mom since 2009 and a student of the Islamic sciences. I've been using the Charlotte Mason method since 2016. I would love to make this method more accessible to a wider audience as I see great value in its holistic method. We're starting with the most classic book in the Charlotte Mason method, the first book in her 6 volume series titled Home Education. We'll work through the book together, inshallah. We'll discuss highlights of the book without the assumption that you've read it yourself. But of course, you'll gain a lot more understanding if you read the book as well. Today, we're simply starting with the preface. Charlotte Mason starts with a really bold statement. She says the educational outlook is rather misty and depressing, both at home and abroad. What I find really interesting when I'm reading through this book is how often her assessment of education, parenting, just culture and life in general is really, really similar to what we see now in 2020. And she read or wrote this book in around the 1900s, 1905, 1910, somewhere around there. So we'll see a lot of times where, we feel that life is new and things are changing and it's never been like this before. And then as she's talking, it's very, very relatable. She says, we have no unifying principle, no definite aim, again, in the realm of education. In fact, no philosophy of education. As a stream can rise no higher than its source, so it is probable that no educational effort can rise above the whole scheme of thought which gives it birth. And perhaps this is the reason of all the fallings from us, vanishings, failures, and disappointments which mark our educational records. She goes on to talk about how in the world of education that we try to have certain laws, certain things that dictate how we do things, the best way to do things, methods, and so on and so forth. So educators are constantly trying to find this law. And if we think about this, how education is today is is a fairly new phenomenon if you look at, centuries and centuries past, where we send all of our kids to these buildings to learn, um, in a lot of different ways, and we'll kind of dig into that a little bit later as we work through the book. But she's saying that there should be some sort of standard that we work from. She says we can discern its outlines, but no more, in talking about the law that we have of education. We know that it is pervasive, that there's no part of a child's home life or schoolwork which the law does not penetrate. So this kind of touches on that idea of education starts when we're babies and it continues basically until you die. There's never really a time where we stop learning. And if we stop learning, life starts taking a backward slide for us. So we should just always expect that this is going to be throughout our life, that we're going to be in some realm of education. And so having this law is beneficial to kind of give us this framework. And also, when she says there's no part of a child's home life or schoolwork which the law does not penetrate, I want to think for a moment about what it means to have the school culture be there. Let's say, in a public school or private school home, that school culture that comes home. A lot of times when, as people of faith, we think about how, okay, well, the school isn't teaching religion, the school isn't teaching the morals and values that I want to teach them. But, I can teach them that at home. But how many of the things that they're being taught at the school that we don't necessarily want them to take root in their hearts and minds, how much of that is coming home? And we have to accept that. So just understanding that this is like a two-way street. She goes on to talk about a number of German thinkers that have, toyed with this idea of the philosophy of education. And they came to this conclusion. She said they are justified that as they say it is necessary to believe in God, that therefore the knowledge of God is the principal knowledge and the chief end of education. And this this really spoke to me, and we'll see this a number of times throughout the Charlotte Mason volumes, that the education is always brought back to the knowledge of our creator. It's always brought back to our faith. And this isn't in a way of like, in our 2020 mindset, we think of dismissing science or whitewashing history, and it doesn't mean that. When we think about like the pedagogy, right, like the thought process behind education, what's the purpose of education? Like what are the ends that are justifying the means? And the way that our education system is set up right now, the ends are employees, really. And I mean, that can be doctors and lawyers and factory workers and electricians and plumbers and managers and whatever. But at the end of the day, the education system is working to make people employable. Whereas in the Charlotte Mason method, we first start with somebody believing in their creator and pleasing their creator, and everything else flows from that. Right. So that's going to make me, inshallah, this would make me let's say, somebody in government, somebody with good ethics and good morals and values, and same thing with like a teacher and so on and so forth, that this knowledge of God is necessary, and that therefore it is the principal knowledge and the chief end to education. And this does take a while if we have come from like the public schooling system to kind of unwrap this in our minds and to start thinking through that, okay, so I'm going to do history, I'm going to do science and so on and so forth. But like, how is this teaching my children to love their creator and for that to sink deeply? And then that makes them employable as well. Instead of they need to be able to go to college, like these check boxes that we see in their future, and we like know that we need to check the earlier boxes. And it's just a very different way of approaching education. So she continues to kind of talk through different thoughts that educational philosophers or thinkers have gone through. She says, though, that the idea of educational philosophy, quote, must regard education not as a shut off department or compartment, but as being as much a part of life as birth or growth, marriage or work, and it must leave the pupil attached to the world at many points of contact. Again, this is not, we pause real life and you go and get an education. It's education is part of your real life, and this flows back and forth. Education should be a connection to real life, not a distraction from it. We don't need to accept that children don't live in the real world. And that's not a healthy dynamic to create in our children either, is that like you live in this other world and we live in the real world. um, we can talk a lot about how that creates an us and them mentality. That's kind of outside of the scope of this, but we should always be thinking about how their education is as much a part of their life as marriage and work and all of these things. And then she starts talking about her aim with this book, and she she has this phrase that it's both very profound and I find it very funny as well. It's something that like I almost want to like get the quote and like put it in one of those picture frames or decals on the wall. It says, "Fools rush in where angels fear to tread." I'm going to say that again. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And it's interesting that she uses this phrase to start off her intentions with writing this series. So she's kind of taking a step back and, humbling us as we're reading her. I think sometimes we put her on a pedestal. And that is when you hear her writing, that's not where she wanted to be. She's simply offering up this method of education that she finds best and finds most effective, recognizing, as she says, "Fools rush in where angels fear to tread." So she then goes on to summarize her ideas in educational philosophy. She says, quote, "The object of education is to put a child in living touch with as much as may be of the life of nature and of thought. And to this one or two keys of self-knowledge, and the educated youth goes forth with some idea of self-management, with some pursuits, and many vital interests." She ends this preface in there's a second preface that we'll talk about just, very, very briefly, but she ends the preface with her 18 principles of her educational philosophy. So this quote that I gave you of, 2 keys of self-knowledge, the educated, goes forth with some idea of self-management, some pursuits, and many vital interests. These are expanded in the 18 principles of the Charlotte Mason method. So we'll go over these pretty quickly. I'll read most of them verbatim, but it's good to know that we're kind of taking this step back and looking at what this book is going to cover, some of the things to give us, when you go on a trip and you look at the wide angle view of, okay, we're going to cover this large area and get that big picture. And so that's what we're doing right now is getting that big picture. And a lot of these points or these principles are going to be expanded either in this book or in following books. So this book, just to be clear, is mostly for children 9 and under. That's the audience that she's the child audience in which she's talking about. Um, but I have read this a number of times with my children being older, and it's really, really valuable. So if your children are older, I wouldn't take a step back from this right now. I would continue to listen to this, especially in the terms of forming habits. That's going to be really, really valuable, whether you're 8, 18, 28, 38, whatever. So her first principle: children are born persons. This is something that she'll really dissect in this book in one particular section, so we'll kind of wait on that. I think because it's such a simple statement, people take a lot of assumptions that they have about what that means, and they assign that to this phrase. So we'll just kind of hold judgment on that one until we get to that section. Number 2, they're not born either good or bad, but with possibilities for good and evil. Number 3, the principles of authority on the one hand and obedience on the other are natural, necessary, and fundamental. This isn't, I'm saying this is an area where as Muslims, 100% agree. 100% agree. The authority on the one hand and obedience on the other are natural, necessary, and fundamental. A lot of times we think of authority and obedience of like parent to child, boss to employee, government worker to lay people, so on and so forth. But as Muslims, first and foremost, we should be thinking about how this relates to us in Allah, that that authority and obedience are natural, necessary, and fundamental. And she will expand upon, like I said, all of these will be expanded upon. This one, I guess, speaks to me personally, and I think as Muslims, it just really rings true for us in how we look at things. Number 4, these principles are limited by the respect due to the personality of children, which must not be encroached upon, whether by fear or love, suggestion or influence, or undue play upon any one natural desire. So, this idea that our children are not just products that we shape and mold into who we want them to be. And I do think that this mode of parenting is something that we're seeing fall away, but it's something that we all recognize that has been done in the past and maybe is still being done, and might be some baggage that we have as parents, that we think of our children as a reflection of us, and therefore we need to change their personality in ways that we find suitable. And this goes back to children are born persons. Number 5, therefore, we are limited to 3 educational instruments: the atmosphere of environment, the discipline of habit, and the presentation of living ideas. Again, that one will be talked about a lot, and she has 6 volumes of this book, and that one will be discussed in great detail. Number 6, by the saying education is an atmosphere, it is not meant that a child should be isolated in what may be called a child environment, especially adapted and prepared. So this kind of goes back to like this idea of like Montessori of the prepared environment in the sense, or I'm sorry, it's opposite of Montessori of having the prepared environment, that we bring children to things as they are, and they are able to interact with them in the ways that they are able. It, again, we'll talk about that more later. Number 7, by education as a discipline is meant the discipline of habits formed definitely and thoughtfully, whether habits of mind or body. In this one, you can't give it less weight than it deserves. The formation of habit. Let me finish this. Physiologists tell us of the adaptation of brain structure to habitual lines of thought. It's interesting. Toward the end of her life, she actually walked back on this statement, saying that science did not prove that there's any kind of change in the brain because of habits, and she regretted saying this. And now we have, science again has changed and taught us about brain plasticity or neuroplasticity, and that habits are a really impactful way of affecting change in our lives and positive change, inshallah. Number 8, in the saying that education is a life, the need of intellectual and moral, as well as physical sustenance, is implied. The mind feeds on ideas, and therefore children should have a generous curriculum. A lot of times we hear this as a liberal curriculum, and she says this herself in a few points, that this is a liberal curriculum. In our day and age, we have specific meaning for what liberal means. And I think that it's better suited in how we use the word liberal to say that it's a generous curriculum. Number 9, but the mind is not a receptacle into which ideas must be dropped, each idea adding to an apperception mass of its like, the theory upon which the Herbartian doctrine of interest rests. So it's this idea of the mind is not a bucket to be filled. There's a quote, I think it goes along the lines, the mind is not a bucket to be filled, but a fire to be kindled. Number 10, on the contrary, a child's mind is no mere sack to hold ideas, but is rather, if the figure may be allowed, a spiritual organism with an appetite for all knowledge. She says some more here. We're going to skip over that just for the sake of time. Number 11, this difference is not a verbal quibble. The Herbartian doctrine lays the stress of education, the preparation of knowledge and enticing morsels presented in due order upon the teacher. Children taught upon this principle are in danger of receiving much teaching with little knowledge. So that's that idea that education is just, filling the brain as a sack of ideas. In that the danger is that they're presented with all this information and that they don't remember any of it. As we can all attest is accurate in how things happen to go. Number 12, but by believing that the normal child has powers of mind that fit him to deal with all knowledge proper to him, we must give him a full and generous curriculum, taking care only that the knowledge is offered to him is vital. That is, the facts are not presented without their informing ideas. Out of this conception comes the principle that, and this is number 13, education is the science of relations. That is, that a child has natural relations with a vast number of things and thoughts, so we must train him upon physical exercises, nature, handicrafts, science, and art, and upon many living books. And this is why you see the Charlotte Mason method has so many subjects, because we want those natural relationships to be apparent, to come to light naturally, because they are presented with such a wide variety of great ideas and experiences that they make those connections. Number 14, there are also two secrets of moral and intellectual self management, which should be offered to children. This we may call the way of the will and the way of the reason. Number 15, the way of the will. Children should be taught A, to distinguish between I want and I will. B, that the way to will effectively is to turn our thoughts from that which we desire but do not will. And she goes on to explain this a little bit more. So we'll kind of save that for another time. But it's this idea of, if I'm doing something that I don't want to do, how do I correct that behavior? And also, she talks about, like, if you get tired of one of your lessons, how do you rejuvenate yourself? How do you come back to it? And that will be something, again, described in greater detail. Number 16, the way of the reason. We should teach children, too, not to lean too confidently onto their own understanding, because the function of reason is to give logical demonstration, A, of mathematical truth, and B, of an initial idea accepted by the will. And then number 17, therefore, children should be taught, as they become mature enough to understand such teaching, that the chief responsibility which rests on them as persons is the acceptance or rejection of initial ideas. And she goes on to talk about this. What this really reminds me of is how often, like, we know this as a fact, that if I already think something and I come across a news article that agrees with what I already think, then I tend to just lean into that. I lean onto what I already think that I know, what already makes sense to me. And her purpose here is talking about how to kind of take a step back from that, to not just lean on our own understanding, and being able to have that reason, have the reasoning to discern whether my understanding is accurate or not. She says these three principles, 15, 16, 17, that's the way of the will, the way of the reason, and teaching children how to kind of take that step back, um, should save children from some of the loose thinking and heedless action, which cause most of us to live at a lower level than we need. Again, this felt really as if it was just written last year. Number 18, the last one in this section, we should allow no separation to grow up between the intellectual and spiritual life of children, but should teach them that the divine spirit has constant access to their spirits, and that they're continual helper in all the interests, duties, and joys of life. She does make a note here that this series is called Home Education, and this first book is called Home Education. And so the series is named after this first book. And she says this series is not as dealing wholly or principally with home as opposed to school education. This first book, as I said, is for particularly for younger children. She even talks about infants and toddlers and those type of things. Um, and she just wants to point out that this is not just for homeschoolers. This would act, if somebody is a teacher, this would be a fantastic book to read, particularly if you have a lot of autonomy in how you teach. This is a really fantastic way to think about this philosophy of education. And then she has a preface to the fourth edition where there's just one thing that I wanted to point out here. She said the particular object of this volume is to show the bearing of the physiology of habit upon education, why certain physical, intellectual, and moral habits are a valuable asset to a child, what may be done toward the formation of such habits. This first volume, and I'll show you the one that I have here. So I have this one. So it's called Home Education, as I said, by Charlotte Mason. There's a lot of different options now. This pink cover that, if you're watching the video here, you'll see this pink cover. This is like the original quote unquote original that was printed about the 1980s, and that was the only option for a long time. This one that I have is from Simply Charlotte Mason. You can find it at simplycharlottemason.com. Why I chose this one is um, it has room on on the sides of the pages, so you can take notes. And then it's facsimiles or copies of the original pages. So that way, if I'm telling you something's on page 14, it's going to be on page 14 throughout any of the printings of this book. In the last about 5 years, there's been a number of people who have reprinted this in different versions. So you can find a couple different ones. What I hear is that the pink ones, the binding doesn't really hold up super well, and they're hard to find, and they're also very expensive. They have essentially become a collectible at this point. So you can find these from simplycharlottemason.com. I also will have a link to these. You can find that on middlewaymom.com/IG hyphen links. So IG hyphen LINKS. So that brings us to the end of the preface today. Inshallah, next time we're going to start with part one, where Charlotte Mason discusses the current state of our educational and parenting model. So as I said before, it's quite interesting how similar her reflections are to our time 100 years later. Just a reminder, you'll gain added benefit by reading the book yourself. I'm just kind of picking out highlights and things that I think that are relevant to our day and age or that are really integral to the model. And in particular, I know that the Muslim community has not jumped onto the Charlotte Mason method because a lot of people believe that it's just for Christians. So there's things that I'll be pointing out that are relevant to us. I have not found many things other than the idea of original sin that she talks about very infrequently. I have not found many things that are out of line with our worldview. If you have any questions that you would like me to answer, you can email those to Shannon, that's SHANNEN, at middlewaymom.com. Again, that's Shannon, SHANNEN, at middlewaymom.com. I will answer those as best I can. Inshallah, we may have some Q&A sessions in the future where we can get those questions answered live as well. Thank you so much, and assalamu alaikum.